I'm really happy to be here and welcome to DefendCon. So in this talk, I'm going to show you how to get started with container forensics when it turns out your cluster is a cluster. So I'm going to cover why you should care, what forensics are, data sources you might use for your investigation for containers specifically, common mitigation options, and what you can do today to prepare. So I'm Ann Wallace. I'm a security practice lead for Google Cloud Professional Services. I've been at Google for about 2 years. Prior to that, I spent 14 years at Nike in various engineering and architecture roles. I live in Portland, Oregon, and do a lot of trail running with my dog, Cedar, here. So, cool. So why are we even talking about container forensics? Do containers get attacked at all? And what kind of attacks are there actually to containers? So looking back about the threats or the attacks we've seen in the wild, back in February of 2018, Tesla made the news for attackers finding their Kubernetes dashboard, which ultimately they got access to their compute and started doing crypto mining. In May of 2018, a researcher notified Shopify that they found a vulnerability in their cluster configuration. Luckily, this was not exploited. In June, Weight Watchers faced the exact same issue as Tesla with an unsecured dashboard. And then that same month, several images were found on Docker Hub that had embedded malware for mining cryptocurrency. And then in April of this year, Docker Hub announced that somebody had accessed their Docker Hub database, which gave them access to usernames, hash passwords, and then tokens for repositories like Bitbucket and GitHub. This affected almost 200,000 users and an unknown number of images. And if any of those images were affected, we have no idea how many times those were pulled. You might think I'm being lazy and not updating this. I mean, given this is October and that only goes to April, I'm not. There just haven't been a lot of threats reported in the wild. There's been a lot of things reported on vulnerabilities with Kubernetes and CPU, but no significant reports of things being exploited live. The interesting fact about these attacks is none of them really affect containers or containerized workloads. That's not the main goal of attackers. It's your compute or your data. So they can start doing things like, well, sending your data out, but mining for cryptocurrencies or building their botnet. So I think before we dive into container forensics, let's talk a little bit about security forensics, and then we can talk about how you can apply that to containers. So really what we want to do here is put ourselves in the best possible position to deal with an incident. We'll spend some time on all 4 of these today, but the real takeaway for today is on collection, and specifically what you need to do in a containerized environment. So you probably have listened to past security presentations and followed Kubernetes best practices guides when standing up your cluster. This is part of the prevention. Yet somebody or something was still able to infiltrate your environment. Now what? Well, don't panic. Don't immediately delete everything, because this is really where that evidence resides that we want to start collecting. In some extreme cases, this might be necessary, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And don't be a hero. Don't log into the servers, the containers, and try to start tracking down what's going on. There's many reasons. Oh, there's orange juice over there. There's many reasons you don't want to do this. One, this lets the attacker know that you know something's going on. And 2, it could potentially compromise your credentials. OK, so you're not panicking, but what are you going to start looking at? So let's start gathering some evidence. This is really why collection is a major stop on today's talk. What we really want to do here is gather a bunch of artifacts, bundle them together, and say, here, it's somewhere in this pile. So we're going to spend some time focusing on how to collect these artifacts as it pertains to Kubernetes and containers. So logs. So I really doubt anyone would question the value of logs when tracking down events. So what we want to do here is identify several meaningful logs and sources and decide on what to do with them. We also want to make sure that the logs are going to a centralized location. This helps you search for events across multiple sources. It helps guarantee that the logs haven't been tampered with, even if the host they're coming from has been compromised. And depending on where you're sending your logs, some of the systems can do anomaly detection and notify you of a possible incident. In the next section, we'll talk about some of the logs and the information you might gather from them. So with disk, in a data center, you actually have to take the machine offline, pull that disk, bring it up in some kind of quarantine environment or isolated environment. Luckily, with cloud, we're able to do this with APIs and take a snapshot and then transparently, bring it up in a different machine or VM and start doing some analysis. Containers, there is no container snapshot mechanism, but we'll talk about some possible options for that. Really, the main point here is you can start doing some analysis without cluing the hacker in that you know what's going on. So live and recorded information. So disk snapshots are great, but that's just a single point in time. What if you want to start actively doing some forensics on the VMs or containers that are being attacked? How do you do that without logging into all the servers? This is where live and recorded information comes in. And when I say recorded, there's ways to get like snapshots of syscalls and so forth, so you can then do further analysis later. So we're going to talk about some open source tools in this area, but they typically are either like container sidecars or agents on the nodes. So the SRE team at Google has this motto: we hope for the best but plan for the worst, and I think this really applies to security and specific, or more specifically, incident response plans. It's really easy for me to stand up here and tell you not to panic when an incident happens, but anybody who's been involved with a security incident or production support issue knows that feeling that sets in when that happens. So having an incident response plan in place gives you or the team something to follow, steps to follow. I mean, they typically have who to contact, what actions to take, how to start collecting that data, and what systems to keep up online to keep your business going. So cool. Let's now talk about how you can apply some of these techniques to containers. So one of the first places you want to start looking when conducting forensics are logs. And actually, many of the logs don't change significantly for containerized environments. So for example, network logs, they remain pretty much the same. But really, you want to be able to tie an IP address back to a pod rather than the node it's running on. So for this talk, we're going to talk about 4 different types of logs: your infrastructure logs, Kubernetes logs, OS logs, and application logs. And all of these have the concept of an audit log. And really, if you're looking to figure out what's going on in your environment and who made it that way, that's where audit logs come in. So let's look at each one of these in more detail. So infrastructure logs, and when I say infrastructure logs, I really mean your cloud infrastructure logs, and different cloud providers call these different things. They're cloud audit logs in GCP, Google, it's CloudTrail. These also, so those logs are typically the API calls made to your cloud provider to do a lot of the CRUD activities. So create a VM, delete a cluster, create storage. These also log denies if somebody continues to try to maybe create a VM that they don't have access to. These also, in my mind, include like your network logs. So they might be VPC flow logs or firewall logs. Some of these are on by default with your cloud provider. Some of them you have to turn on. So this is a sample of a cloud audit log from Google for creating a cluster. So it includes information about the request, like the type of operation, how it was authenticated and authorized, and information about the content of the request. So like the version chosen for the GKE cluster. Cool. So Kubernetes audit logs are actions taken in Kubernetes. They're part of the Kube API server. A given request will generate events at multiple points in its life cycle. So when a request is received, when a response is started, and when a response is completed. And just like other types of logs, Kubernetes logs events at different depths of detail based on the information that's included. There's 4 different types of audit levels. So none, it doesn't log anything at all. The metadata, which logs the request metadata, which includes the user, timestamp, resource, and verb. This is a good choice for operations when the verb is enough to tell you what's going on. And then request, which logs metadata plus the request body. This is a good choice for operations where you're changing configurations. And then request response, excuse me, which logs the event metadata and the request body plus the request response body. Operating system logs. So these are the logs on your node, your VM, not I'm not talking about the operating system in your container if there actually is an operating system. So these include network connections, user login like SSH, certain executions. It could be how your containers are starting up because Docker is running on the node. So when you collect these logs in Kubernetes, you deploy a logging agent as a daemon set like FluentD to collect the logs, and then that will write to your logging infrastructure like Stackdriver, Elasticsearch, and Kibana. FluentD has great documentation on how to do this, but basically you need to provide the FluentD daemon set with the log storage pods host and port, and then give FluentD the right permissions, and it'll take care of the rest for you. So application logs, which are logs from your application. These don't really change in Kubernetes, but how you get these is a little bit different. Actually, it's really easy. We just talked about it. You just need to deploy a logging agent as a daemon set to collect the logs, and then it will write it to your logging infrastructure. So let's look at how to tie all this together. Where do the logs come from and where do they go? So again, the infrastructure logs, the logs probably coming from your cloud provider. When you set these up, you probably have specified somewhere for them to get written to, so probably some kind of storage bucket. So there's multiple ways, depending on your logging infrastructure, how you can get these from the bucket. You could pull or push. So then with Kubernetes logs, you can also use something like the daemon set and FluentD to push it to your logging infrastructure. If you're using managed Kubernetes, these are probably ingested for you. And then with your OS and application logs, again, you can collect these yourself using something like FluentD. Again, like I mentioned in the first slide, you probably want to get all your logs going to a central location because it makes it easy to filter over the possible events that occurred in your environment altogether. This also means you need to be really careful about having consistent identifiers for the same resource across different logs so you can easily correlate these together. You probably want to back up these logs or a subset of them based on your attention requirements. So cool, so disk. In this example, we're using an API to create a snapshot of a disk of the affected node and send the copy of the snapshot over to an isolated environment for further analysis. Here we've created a different GCP project for handling the artifacts, but it could be a different AWS account, VPC network, so forth. This is good for figuring out, again, what's going on in the node or the VM, but it doesn't necessarily help you with what was going on in the container at the point in time the snapshot was taken. So like I said, there isn't really a snapshot mechanism for containers. There is, however, an open source project called Docker Explorer. This helps forensic engineers explore the offline Docker file system of a disk snapshot that you just sent over for analysis. So for example, with like a GCE disk snapshot, you get a copy of varlib Docker. So Docker Explorer is just a Python script that does some JSON parsing. So if you mounted that disk snapshot, you can run Docker Explorer on the mounted varlib Docker, do run list containers. This will show you all the containers that were running and some metadata with them at the time the snapshot was taken. And then if you have an idea of the container that might have been possibly compromised, you can then, using Docker Explorer, mount that file system and then just use your typical Unix tools to explore that file system to get an idea of what was going on, possibly during that attack. So yeah, like I said earlier, the snapshot is good for that point in time, but if you want to see what's going on or explore what's going on during an active attack or other events, this is where the live and recorded information comes in. There's several off-the-shelf container security companies that do things similar to this. I wanted to focus on a few open source projects for this talk, so you could just, things that you could go play with today without spending any money. So the first one we're going to talk about is called GRR. It's an open source project from Google, which stands for GRR Rapid Response. It's an incident response framework focused on conducting live remote forensics on VMs. So the TLDR here on this slide is, this is an agent you install on your VMs. It gives root-like capabilities, so secure it before you go. So with GUR, you can get remote detailed monitoring of your CPU, memory, I/O, and so forth. You can also get memory dumps. You're also able to get contents of a file. So GUR has two main activities here. Flow, GUR flow is when you've asked GUR to go find out something for you on a VM. So again, maybe you want to get the memory running on a certain process, or maybe you want to get information about a certain file. That's when you would use a flow. A hunt is always looking for something bad, so maybe like a specific jar file or a malware signature. And again, GUR, because it's for VMs, it doesn't map Docker processes back to OS PIDs. This is where some of Sysdig's open source projects come into play. So Sysdig capture, it records syscalls in a capture file, which can help you diagnose what was going on when that file was when capture was ran. And inspect is an open source project as well, but it's an interface that displays the information in those capture files. So the content is organized in these different tiles, which shows values of relevant metrics and its trends. You can click on them and get more information. You can also correlate them together. And you're also able to narrow down the search based on a time window. And just like GUR, you're able to get detailed information, but for containers on CPU, memory, network, and even the contents of a file. Cool, so more water. So now that you've detected something, what should you actually do in your environment in response? So let's talk about some common mitigation options that you have for containers. So mitigation options, you could send an alert, isolate a container, pause a container, restart a container, kill a container. These options are increasing in order of certainty and order of severity. Killing a container is really your last possible option. Even in the worst case scenario, it might not even be your best option. Like I explained, there's not really a good way to snapshot containers, so live forensics is often your best bet. And if you kill a container, you lose that opportunity for further analysis. So let's go through each of these options, why you might use it and how you might, or why you might use it and how you can use it. So alerting notifies your security team that something unusual has been detected. And this, again, is about sending potential events to your security incident response team to triage. This is typically the first step before you take some of the other actions. So if you're getting all your logs in one place like you should be, your alerting should leverage that. And you can use the same alerting tools that your ops team is already using and likely send the alerts, an email, SMS, PagerDuty, Slack, whatever. And an alert should be on specific metrics or specific actions, like a usage of CPU, spike in your container, or unusual network connections. The hard part is actually figuring out what to alert on. So the next option is isolate. And I don't mean isolate in the sense of workload isolation exactly like when you talk about running untrusted code in a multi-tenant cluster. I mean more like quarantine. So this is when you want to move the container somewhere else to examine it better, but not necessarily where it knows anything is up. You probably want to do this when your container is doing something odd, but the workload affected isn't necessarily critical to your business. This should help limit the damage in your environment, for example, by preventing the attacker from moving laterally or spreading further, or preventing a bad service from DOSing the other services. This is more difficult to do than some of the other options because there's nothing built in to just do this. So basically, you need to move your container to a new network. This is usually done by rescheduling the workload onto a new node. This is better than draining the pods from other workloads on the same node and rescheduling them. Just in case those have also been affected, you're losing potential information. So once you've isolated this workload onto the new node, you can make sure nothing gets scheduled to that node by using kubectl cordon. Then you can do something like creating a restricted network policy. Then this will allow you to set up live forensics on node agents, do some network filtering to actually see what's going on. So pausing containers suspends all the running processes in a container. This is a good choice when you have a decent idea of what the issue is and you just need to get some quick data for record keeping to confirm or to determine what actions to take next. This is particularly useful step for conducting further forensics. One example is crypto mining. It's not actually harmful to your workload, but it could be costing you quite a bit. By pausing the container, you have the opportunity to take a backup and figure out what the source of the issue is before you restart the container. Pausing a container, it's really easy. It's built in. You just run docker pause. So restarting a container kills the container, restarts the running container, and resets the current state of the application. Restarting a container makes sense when you already have a fix for the problem and you're wanting to start rolling it out. Again, you need to be careful with restarts, and these really don't make sense unless you already know where the issue is coming from. So if you don't know where it's coming from, say as an attacker has compromised your container and you restart it, you're kicking them off that, and you're letting them know that you know they're there, and once the container comes back up, they're basically going to get back on. But if you need to restart a container, you can do this with docker restart or cube delete pod, which will delete the pod and then it'll get rescheduled. But honestly, if you have a fix for this and you're rolling out a fix, just roll out the new image as you do, as you would deploy any other image. So lastly, killing a container. This is last resort. It halts the running process in the container, and like the restart, it lets the attacker know that you know what's going on, and it doesn't fix the underlying problem. Plus, it takes your workload offline. But again, you might do this in the worst case scenario. So say that your workload is actively being exploited, such as sending out sensitive data or information. This is probably the best bet for that because you really want to stop the leak immediately. That's more important than figuring out how it happened. So you can do this with Docker stop or Docker kill. Docker stop is just more graceful than Docker kill, but honestly, if you're at this point, just use Docker kill. All right, so let's apply some of this knowledge to a real-world scenario. So let's look at a common container attack, privilege escalation, or container escape. Privilege escalation allows the container to effectively break out of its isolated context and become root on the server it's running on and potentially gaining access to other containers on that node. In February of this year, there was a vulnerability that allowed malicious containers to overwrite the host runc binary, and then it waits for the Docker daemon to do another Docker exec, which then gives it root-like code execution on the host. So let's say you get a notification from your cloud provider that they say that there's some suspicious traffic coming from one of your hosts, one of your nodes, or maybe your monitoring system alerts you of some CPU spikes. Neither one of these necessarily means an attack is going on, but what it does is give you some information. It potentially gives you a date and time or a time range. It gives you possibly affected nodes or containers, and then it gives you some metrics like CPU and network traffic. And since you've listened to this presentation, you've prepared ahead of time, you have systems and services in place to start gathering some information. So let's first look at logs. So since you know a date and time range, you could search on that. You could search for the metrics and see if there's other nodes that have been affected with the CPU spike or network traffic. Maybe you've done some searching, you've narrowed this down. So you want to look at maybe your OS logs. Are there containers being run in privileged mode or as root, or mounting file systems they shouldn't? Again, these don't necessarily mean attacks going on, but it could alert you that something malicious might be happening. Your container logs. You should have a pretty good idea of the processes and commands that are being ran in your container. Are there commands that are being ran that shouldn't be? Maybe wget was being ran and downloaded some malware. If you take note of that file that got downloaded, you can use some of your other tools to then inspect that file. And network logs, again, are you seeing increased unexpected outbound traffic from affected nodes? This could be meaning that data is getting sent out somewhere it shouldn't. So with disk, so you have that point-in-time snapshot of what was going on potentially during the attack. And if we go back to that example of the runc binary getting overwritten, what you also have is a good disk image, or node image that all your nodes get created from. So you could effectively, the snapshot and the good known image, do a diff and see if there's any binaries that have changed that shouldn't have changed. Again, for example, like the runc binary. And then with the live information, so you're able to get a more detailed information than you might from the log. So again, you can correlate maybe the network event back to the process that made that connection, which then you can track back to the binary or file that spawned that process. And then in the case of it being a shell script, maybe the malware, you can also get the contents of that file to do some inspection of where this might have came from, or what the potential attack is. And so going back to some of the mitigation options that I talked about in the last section, the ones you probably want to focus on are alert and isolate. So in the case of privilege escalation, some of the things that you might get alerted on, again, are your containers being ran in a way they shouldn't be. So again, as root or in privilege mode. And then so after identifying the container node that was affected, you'll want to quarantine it. But if there actually was a container escape, that means that they probably have access to the node. So you probably want to, all the nodes that your container could have possibly touched, you probably want to get rid of. So that probably means creating a new node pool and migrating clean pods over. And then once you've identified the fix for the container, you would then roll out the update to the new node pool. So what can you do today? This is a lot of information that we've talked about, or I've talked about in half an hour. So create that incident response plan. And follow container security best practices when creating your clusters. Keep up to date with that. I mean, just containers or anything. The security landscape's changing all the time, and the tools are evolving as well. Make sure all your logs are going to a central location. And then invest in container security specific tools, if they're open source or not. And then rehearse the process with a fake event. You don't want the first time you go through this when it's a real event. You want to figure out where all the pointy edges are, and rehearse this every, if it's at quarterly or at some frequency. And don't panic, you've got this. Cool. So these are some resources that I referenced throughout this presentation. I think these slides are also available. I uploaded them to the site, so I'm sure they're going to be available for people to download at some point. So, cool. I can go back to this slide or you can take a picture of my dog. Sorry. So, cool. Thank you.